Hi everyone, this is Brooke, the founder of the Santa Barbara Blockchain Institute with a mission of bringing Bitcoin lessons to everyone. You're aware that we're part of the way through my 10 lesson series on Bitcoin and blockchain technology, and today we're going to talk about a subject with quite a bit of controversy around it, and that's the world of altcoins. So the Bitcoin code was unleashed on the world in 2009 as an open source computer program that anybody could download. Of course, anybody could also copy it and modify it and come out with their own version of blockchains, tokens, coins, etc. That's exactly what has happened over the last 10 years. So today's subject is about whether that is a good thing, a bad thing, or perhaps somewhere in the middle. Before we go any farther, though, my disclosures: this is not investment advice. This is just an informational, educational lecture. I'm not a programmer or a technical guy, but I do personally hold digital assets, so I do have skin in the game. So the essential controversies behind the world of altcoins are two in nature. And again, altcoin is the name given to any token with an associated blockchain that's derived or modified from the original Bitcoin code. So these two controversies are: one, should they even exist? Should we even be trying to create alternative versions of blockchains and coins? And the group of people who are sort of hardcore Bitcoiners, also nicknamed maximalists, they would argue that no, Bitcoin has everything that we need and it really shouldn't be modified at all because it only introduces other weaknesses that we'll discuss. And so there's really nothing behind any of the other coins. I'm not so sure I adopt that view because as a technology, I think there's probably room for other things to come up. We just don't know them yet. But I do agree that there's an awful lot of risk in the copies so far that have been made. So we'll talk about that. The second controversy is on the enforcement side. What the heck are all of these things that are being created, and do they fall into the category of commodities as Bitcoin has been judged to be, or are they securities, or are they something else? What kind of regulation do we need for this crypto world, and who's going to do it? So it's quite a highly emotionally charged area in this discussion, but we're going to try and wade through it pretty quickly and just kind of point out the pros and cons of each side. So I'll refresh your memory with the model that I made of blockchains basically derived from Bitcoin. And so they've got a use case. In the case of Bitcoin, it was a peer-to-peer electronic currency that operates outside of the traditional banking system. And the consensus protocol that Bitcoin uses is a proof of work, which means that you've got to expend and use energy and expend work and time to create the new Bitcoins, which are awarded to the miners who validate the blocks, perform work, and secure the network. The supply distribution operation in the case of Bitcoin, we know, has been locked in with that chart that I showed you earlier about how the coin is distributed over time and how it has a finite number of coins to be mined in its lifetime, in the next 110 years or so. But it is a limited supply, absolutely, and that's unique. And lastly, of course, security is important to anybody who's dealing with tokens of value of any sort. So I'm going to refresh your memory also with the Bitcoin uniqueness, with this idea of immaculate conception with no known founders and apparently the inventor just sort of stepping away from it and disappearing. That is extraordinarily unique, and what that has brought is really, it's made this uniquely decentralized, which is sort of a huge point of this whole blockchain identity, this blockchain philosophy, is that it is not controllable by parties. So in order to not be controllable, it needs really to be super, super decentralized, and really none of the other, or virtually none of the other coins and blockchains that have come up have been able to achieve that level of decentralization. They all have founders who are active, or boards of directors, or venture capitalists. They have lenders involved. There are other people involved who still have an active working interest, and there are people looking to make a profit, of course. So it's been virtually impossible, and it may be impossible unless some really altruistic people, as in Satoshi Nakamoto, come along and create another coin that from which they really don't profit at all or seek to control. It's very difficult. So again, that decentralization without a single point of control is really a big part of this conversation. Because of that, Bitcoin, even by the Securities and Exchange Commission, has been labeled to be like a digital gold. It is a commodity because no one is in charge of it. If you invest the time, effort, and work and you want some gold, you can go out and you can mine some and you can get it for yourself. There's nobody issuing it. It is issuerless. And the process is decentralized. Anybody can pick it up and start it or leave off from doing it at any time. And that's really why it's considered to be a commodity. We'll talk about a test for that a little bit later. The altcoin world, anything later derived from the Bitcoin code, they're more like programmable contracts. And we all know that I like that phrase because both of those words have insinuate both positive and negative things. We've all worked with fantastic programs. We've also know that there exist terrible programs or malware, actually programs that are made to hurt us. We also know that some contracts are very good and well executed, and other contracts are terrible, poorly written, poorly executed, and so forth. So programmable contracts has got a lot of room for both success and critical failure in it. But that's kind of what the altcoin world is like right now. So if we think about our entire business world in a sort of a global perspective, it all consists of written contracts and agreements in one form or another. This is done between parties who wish to conduct business, whether they be selling goods or providing services or anything like that. All these office buildings are filled with people who are carrying out contracts and agreements between parties. Oftentimes, in our complex world, we need intermediaries to interpret and to enforce and to affect these contracts. So we have the bankers and we have the lawyers and we have the accountants to help us. And then this is all underwritten by sort of a base of three things. We sort of require actual performance, so we need to be able to measure the performance of these contracts. And so we have all sorts of systems in place to measure performance. We also rely on trust. We trust that the person that we're doing business with is who they represent. And so we have a system of tokens and identities and all that sort of thing in place to give us trust in the party on the other side. But we need to hold that trust. When those two things fail, when the performance fails and the trusted part of the party fails, then we have law to fall back on, and we count on law, the rule of law, to kind of enforce parts of contracts that have gone poorly or not been performed, etc. So we've got this massive network of underlying conditions to these contracts and agreements and ways that we work it out. So you may be able to see that there is room, at least I believe there's room for something called a smart contract, which might be a blockchain version of a contract. Indeed, these are already in existence in some of these new altcoin platforms that are designed for this. But we're still working out exactly how does that go and who's in charge of these things. Because again, most of these are not issuerless and most of these have controlling parties. So how does that work with a contract? If there's somebody out there controlling the whole foundational protocol that you're using for the contracts. At any rate, these contracts are validated cooperatively, as we saw with how Bitcoin transactions are validated, and then they are placed and live on a blockchain. Like Bitcoin, they don't really rely on the parties, and they kind of work outside the authorities and all of that. So they need to be well written and well executed and all that. If we're not going to have that underlying network of trust law and actual performance, we need to have these contracts really be perfectly written so that they are perfectly executed. So there's difficulty there. Now, the interesting thing about these contracts also, because they're on a blockchain, which as you now know is time segmented, they can use time to execute parts of their contracts. As a certain amount of time goes by and something happens. They can also use exterior conditions, such as the price of X drops to below Y, and this contract on a blockchain will auto-execute. It will execute itself, and it might charge somebody's Bitcoin account and send it over to somebody else, and then it might track the product or service through the real world using the Internet of Things, using sensors that are going to send back data to the contract. And then they're going to confirm that, for example, the shipment has arrived and the final payment can be sent. All this could be done automatically, and it's pretty easy to see with anybody with any imagination that this could be super useful and could eliminate a lot of intermediaries and could be a lot speedier. You can also understand that these contracts, they could be pretty complex just on their own. These if-then statements, if you layer them, 8 or 10 if-thens deep, it could be a pretty complex set of instructions that can be recorded on a blockchain and carried out without really any further intervention. So the conceptual idea of of smart contracts and using blockchains with cooperative management of contracts, that seems like it holds water. It's just a question of how do we do it? One of the big challenges has been, and this is a part of that Bitcoin maximalism, is that we've discovered that when we use distributed networks, which is what the Bitcoin network is, a really huge part of it, like I said, is that decentralization. And it turns out that there's sort of three things that you can't get all of, at least not with this existing technology. So you got to kind of pick two out of the three. You can either be highly, highly decentralized like Bitcoin is, and have great security like Bitcoin. And if you want to do those two things, then you're going to sacrifice a little of the third, scalability, and so forth. So you can kind of have two out of the three, but the trilemma is you can't really have a robust system that has all of these because they counteract each other a little bit. So with the altcoin world, the one that we've run into the most trouble with is the decentralization one. Bitcoin really is decentralized. It really doesn't have anybody in charge of it, but every other one just about that has come up has shown to be in control or in charge by certain parties, a smaller group of people somehow controlling it, say that they own the tokens or that they have control over, so for example, changing the protocol that's used, or they can modify the network, they can modify the blockchain. So anytime there's a group there that has some sort of control over it, to the possible detriment of others, you've kind of lost that decentralization part. Now, they may be very scalable, which is one complaint about Bitcoin right now, is that it won't scale to the world. That remains to be seen. It is highly, highly, highly divisible. And we're building layer twos and things like that now to see perhaps if we can improve that scalability. And there's also the issue that Bitcoin provides a final settlement under an hour, whereas most of our traditional finance, even though we think that it's a final settlement, Venmo from me to you, it's actually not final for probably 60 to 90 days, and credit cards have chargebacks and the banks can reverse charge. So there's a difference in definition also. At any rate, here's the trilemma of distributed networks, and know that the biggest one that we face is that decentralization one at the top, and that has led to the downfall. If you're not decentralized, you can have a gentleman like Sam be at the top of it, and as we discovered here in 2022, he could be doing things behind an opaque wall that nobody knows about, and we're back to that human management problem where we introduce weakness and perhaps even fraud. So decentralization, really, the biggest thing about Bitcoin this year in 2022 is every 10 minutes it has produced another block exactly on time. It has functioned perfectly from a technical standpoint, and it has not allowed anybody to mess with it. It has not been hacked. And this is like the 10th year in a row that this has happened, where it has had absolute 100% perfect technical functioning and in a decentralized network with nobody in control, which is fantastic, which is why it's there. So there are reasons for maximalists to hold those core beliefs, but I think we need to leave the door open because usually something else will come along and solve some problems that exist. So in addition to that decentralization issue, there are also issues with some of the other areas of my four blockchains here, and we'll leave security alone for now. But in terms of consensus protocols, we've come up with a lot of different ways to prove, to validate the network. So we've got proof of work, participation, proof of history, proof of burn. Ethereum this year changed from, or last year, I beg your pardon, changed from proof of work to proof of stake, and we're still trying to see, did that affect the decentralization or did it not? How is that going? And so the jury is still out. But these are the reasons behind a lot of the controversy you may hear in this altcoin space, is because they're wrestling with the trilemma of decentralized networks, of distributed networks. So the second thing I wanted to talk about in terms of the altcoin space is regulation. Oh, regulation. It's really difficult because innovation is always way, way out in front of regulation. I like to think about when the first cars came out off the assembly line from Henry Ford's factory, there probably weren't any speed limits anywhere. It took probably some time for speed limits to be enacted and enforced around the country, which, people finally realized, yeah, that'd be a good thing. And then decades later, decades later, we also decided, seatbelts might be a good idea too. So you can see that really it's hard to do effective regulation, how hard to know when to step in, how much to step in, and so forth. I like this excerpt I pulled off of our actual federal regulations that make it a federal crime to deliver in interstate commerce a toy marble unless it has a warning that says, quote, "This toy is a marble." Wow. So you can see how regulation can also get carried away and create this morass of rules and laws that really stifle innovation. And we don't want to do that either. So again, there's a balancing act here between regulating and enforcing and innovating. So one other quick element so that you know what the enforcement guys are working with, and this is the same also for all of the folks who are innovating in the field. We have to figure out what are these things we're creating because they don't function, they're entirely online. They're not really functioning in a tangible world. And we need to understand who's going to regulate them also. I mentioned that Bitcoin is a commodity. It pretty much fails this test. Because it is issuerless. It is decentralized to the point where there is no one in charge of it. So what you do, you get out yourself. It's not really the efforts of others in that respect. But some time ago, the Supreme Court had a case in front of it involving a gentleman named Howey. And from there, they developed this Howey test to decide what is an investment contract? How can you raise money from the general public legally? Because we want for people to just invent stuff and then go and advertise it and sell it to the world and raise a bunch of money and then poof, disappear or have their product collapse because it wasn't worthy to begin with. And so we want some way to regulate how we need to define, does the SEC get to regulate something as an investment contract, or does it act on its own, or does it get regulated by a different body? So the Howey test simply is an investment of money, check, in a common enterprise, check, with the expectation of profit, probably, to be derived from the efforts of others. And that's one of the ones, actually several of these kind of caused the Bitcoin original to really fail this test. And so the SEC itself has said that Bitcoin is a commodity, but virtually almost every other one of it really kind of may not fail this test. And I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an expert in this, but it sure seems to me like a lot of the tokens and coins and the subsequent copies of Bitcoin might actually fall under the definition of being an investment contract. And so this is the other controversial topic that really needs to get sorted out pretty quickly. But again, innovation is just so far out in front of regulation, especially in this digital world. So it's a challenge, and that's the basics of the challenge. So basically, buyer beware. I personally am convinced that Bitcoin is going to continue to thrive, but the other ones, do your due diligence, study the potential investments, and make your own decisions carefully. So to wrap up, Bitcoin is like digital gold. It's been judged to be a commodity. It has no issuer. There's not really a joint endeavor going on here because people are acting on their own, whether they purchase it or whether that they take a part in the validation and try to earn it. It's a lot more like going to mine for gold. Altcoins, on the other hand, they are a little bit more like programmable money or programmable contracts. And whenever there are issuers involved, whenever there are people that are controlling, exerting some sort of control and directing the future of this protocol, tokens are probably not going to be judged to be commodities, but instead they'll be called securities, like stocks. And then they'll be subject to, human ethics and how people behave. And it's a good process to go through. We need to control the fraud, and this is a way that the reason why there's some control here is because if something is deemed to become a security, before the founders can go ahead and sell it to the public, they need to file reports with the SEC. These can be burdensome and costly and time consuming, so they would rather just proceed with their innovation. But what they do is that they show to the SEC and thus to the world, here are the founders, here are the people in charge, this is how it works, this is what the expectations are, here are the investment risks, and they put it all out transparently and flatly for everyone to see so they can be held to account. That has not happened for a lot of these altcoins that have just been pushed out because regulation has been following so far behind. They haven't really been judged to be anything just yet. So we shall see what happens, but I hope I've laid those arguments out so you understand a little bit about what the challenges are. And we look forward to getting these definitions more nailed down more securely so we can continue to innovate and grow this exciting new technology. So in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about blockchains in the business world because, as I mentioned, with all of these agreements and contracts going on, it sure seems to me like there's some room for that in the business world. So that will be next. Thanks for watching.